The following is an archived episode of Keeping It Real with Dr. Gene Kennedy. This is part one of an exclusive two-part interview with the legendary Richard O. Moore. Keeping It Real with Dr. Gene Kennedy is broadcast on KFCF 88.1 FM, Free Speech Radio for Central California. For more details on this show, visit Keeping It Real with Dr. Gene Kennedy at facebook.com.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am so pleased to be here with you again another time. Welcome to Keeping It Real with Dr. Gene Kennedy and her crew. So listen, we're going to change gears here. Brother Chatone has done an excellent job in lining up some guests tonight, and I want to give him his undivided time on that, and want our audience to be able to take away some good things with us. This is our month of Black History Month. So many celebrations are going on around our campuses, around our community, and please, my listening audience, participate in these areas. But tonight we want to bring you a show. Want to talk about the focus that we're going to have tonight is on civil rights and the Western Front, past, present, and future. Good evening, Brother Julius.
Bonsoir, buenas noches, good evening. This is Julius Chatone, and it's a pleasure to be back with the team, Keeping It Real with Dr. Gene Kennedy. The 1960s in the United States is often portrayed by our modern media as a time period which offered a much simpler life than the one we know today. Real estate prices for the average home ranged somewhere between $16,000 and $27,000. The British invasion on American pop culture was producing many chart-topping music groups, and the biggest innovations in technology were the color television and the portable record player. Anyone reflecting on the vintage images of teenage baby boomers rocking out to the Beatles or the ever-growing influx of non-denominational churches would probably conclude that in the era of flower power, our nation, and everyone in it, seemed tolerant of diversity and utterly carefree. The realities, however, are that life in the United States was not equally enjoyable for all of its citizens during the early 60s. The same country which developed a reputation for advocating for peace by aiding in the abolition of Adolf Hitler's European dictatorship and providing police actions between North and South Korea also had a reputation of maintaining their own brand of oppression strictly unique to the Western culture. That brand of oppression was none other than segregation of African Americans, or Negroes, which is a title that was still being implemented by the early 60s. As we know, the United States is a nation which spent hundreds of years pounding the Western Front of Africa, capturing and enslaving Africans for the purposes of building a nation in which we now reside. However, by the time we reached the early 1960s, many of the horrendous yet lawful violations against human life had become obsolete with the abolition of slavery and the assimilation of African Americans into mainstream society. Yet, even with such progressions in the fight towards Western racial equality, the state still made it clear that blacks had not yet earned the rights of enjoying many of the freedoms and luxuries that the post-slave trade America had to offer. During the early 60s, laws may have already forced cities across the nation to integrate their water fountains and restrooms. However, many movie houses and neighborhoods were still segregated. Certain companies, such as H.W. Woolworth, employed many African-American workers, including my great-grandmother. However, when it came time to take a lunch break, those black workers were still banned from eating at the food counters with their white colleagues. Mm-hmm. Public schools were legally obligated to integrate black students into their institutions by the early 60s. However, certain clubs within many schools were still exclusive to white students. Many African-American girls of the 60s, 70s, and even 80s recall exclusion from certain groups called cotillions, which according to ehow.com is a type of training that young adults and children attend to learn proper etiquette, manners, and social behaviors within the context of formal dancing. It was an extreme rarity to see African-American girls being granted the privilege of learning the European social graces that cotillions had to offer. To this day, many cotillions still choose to exclude members based on socioeconomic, religious, or heritage background. It may not have been entirely clear as to why African Americans were granted basic rights, yet were still denied from the privileges of everyday life. The implication, however, was that this country still wasn't fully prepared to embrace the idea of African Americans being completely equal to European Americans. Those who possessed a passionate desire to attain equality for all who reside under our American flag were the ones who made the civil rights movement possible and continue to keep it alive to this very day. It is on that note that I'd like to introduce our first guest, who happens to be an integral contributor to some of the successes in the fight for equality. As one of the co-founders of the Berkeley-based KPFA Pacifica Radio and producer of such influential films as Take This Hammer, starring James Baldwin, and The Louisiana Diary, Richard O. Moore's career, which has spanned more than 6 decades, has gained him the reputation of unearthing injustice and giving peace a voice. And at 91 years young, Mr. Moore still has not yielded an ounce of creativity, as he still remains an active poet. Mr. Moore, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, Julius, for those very laudatory words. Incidentally, I'm absolutely delighted to find free speech radio in Fresno, and I hope throughout the entire San Joaquin Valley, because I've been streaming your program on the computer. And I really congratulate Dr. Kennedy and Willow and you on what you're doing. And also the new addition to the program coming up with the concentration on youth.
Great. Thank you, and welcome, sir. Welcome to our show this evening.
Thank you so much for coming. It really is an honor, and I'm sure that all of us associated with Free Speech Radio thank you and find it a great pleasure that you are joining us this evening. I was wondering, in the midst of social adversity, what do you think compels a journalist or a documentarian to cover stories or advocate for causes which may not always win them the popularity points with the general public?
Well, in the first place, social adversity is exactly what any journalist worth his or her salt should concentrate on. And I don't happen to think that popularity with the public, for example, plays any role in journalism, because a good journalist needs to have a passionate interest in the dominant issues of his or her time. And although this passion may, of course, lead to tensions, within the family and with friends, that's not an issue having to do with journalism. What is an issue, however, is the backstory, the question of whose hands are on the levers of power, and how do I bring the story to light? And by that I mean, well, how do I break through the censorship of those in power, which is exercised at every level in the society, from education to the media, meaning the very information sources plus entertainment, to the government. A journalist is kind of like a canary in the mine shaft, but fortunately, a higher percentage of journalists survive than canaries.
Very good.
Absolutely. Yes, I totally agree with that. And, I imagine that's what your ideals were when you created your films, such as Take This Hammer.
Yeah, well, I had an interest in what was happening in the country, and actually there were 4 films devoted to so-called black issues. One was Take This Hammer, in which we tried to, we brought James Baldwin to San Francisco to look at this so-called liberal society and to look at the underside of it. And we discovered, everything that, every ill that you can imagine in the society during that time. And those ills still exist. They haven't been remedied.
Yeah, so true.
They've just changed their form and become more subtle.
You're right.
But economic slavery is nearly as great as private property slavery.
That really is a good point.
That is very true. That's a good point.
Valid point, yes. I tell you, the Civil Rights era was indeed a time of great division. While African Americans and immigrants from other countries struggled with feelings of exclusion, many white Americans who chose to fight for equal rights alongside African Americans undoubtedly experienced similar exclusion from their own communities simply because of their convictions. What do you think compels someone to sacrifice the approval of family and friends in pursuit of rights that they themselves already have?
Oh, well, to begin with, I don't think it's possible to have a vision of a just and equitable society and not to break away from the practices of one's class or group, in my instance, a white male. If you believe in certain issues or questions, you have to take action. And it was a matter. It wasn't so much a matter of our joining an existing movement as recognizing the injustices that existed in the society, and as journalists, taking advantage of our special privilege in terms of access to events and act on them. And there were big changes that going on at that time, which we might want to talk about later.
Yeah, absolutely, we would. I believe that Dr. Kennedy has a question for you.
Sure.
Yes. Again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come in, Mr. Moore. And you sound so strong for your age.
Well, I'm going to be 92 at the end of this month, so.
My goodness, my
Incredible.
Goodness. Big ups to you, my brother. Big
Real
ups.
inspiration to everyone.
Wonderful. And because you've been in the journalism environment, I have a question around that. So during the early 1960s, how integral a role did the journalism play in accomplishments made towards the civil rights movement? What was going on in that area?
I think there's several things to say in response to that question. It played an integral role in informing people of what was going on. Mm-hmm. Up to that point, most journalism had been, at a remove in sort of the CBS so-called objective tradition. Mm-hmm. In the 1960s, a couple of things happened. One, it became possible for reporters to be on the scene in their images. And those images were broadcast nationally. Mm-hmm. And this did have an impact on many people, black, white, Latino, whatever. And many of them went to the South, particularly youth, to take part in these activities. And there were a couple of other things. There were some technological developments, such as the development of light camera gear, which permitted the journalist to be on the scene as distinct from watching from a distance. It permitted the journalist to be part of what was going on rather than a commentator from a distance about what was going on and the necessary distortions that reporter would have, put on the story. In other words, you were there. Mm-hmm. And that became possible in the 1960s in a way that it hadn't been before. So I think that it ushered in a new practice in journalism, which I tend to call participatory journalism.
Yes. And you're so right, because I know for myself, in the 60s, I was in England. Yeah. And I was only seeing through the eyes of the journalists and the media what was going on in this whole civil rights movement. We were dealing with South Africa, but we also had an opportunity to also see what was going on here in the United States of America. So that was the power of journalism in that respect.
And I don't mean to dismiss the great tradition of Edgar R. Murrow and the other journalists of note, but journalism did change during the 60s, and it changed, I think, for the better. And it took, one program I remember is one called Yankee No, which was made when Fidel made his triumphal entry into Havana. Mm-hmm. And there was an ABC, believe it or not, a program shot during that whole procession, that elaborate and triumphal event. And it was broadcast, and a lot of people saw it. And a lot of traditional journalists absolutely dismissed it. Mm-hmm. But it was nonetheless the beginning of a new tradition in which the media played a new role of being a part rather than a part from the event going on.
I surely would like to know what is the difference with the journalism today.
Journalism has retreated. Why has it retreated? Well, it's become the property of corporate ownership. Uh-huh. And that makes it very difficult, regardless of whether or not you have a camera which will permit you to be on the scene. More frequently than not, you're not on the scene. It is true, however, that first take the Occupy movement, which is nationwide and worldwide. It's possible to get a certain picture, but by the time it gets filtered through the news media, it's a different picture from what was actually going on.
Yes.
Be sure to tune in to part 2 of this episode of Keeping It Real with Dr. Gene Kennedy as we continue the discussion with the legendary Richard O. Moore.